In the 13th century, when maps still warned of dragons and the edge of the known world faded into myth, one Venetian traveller dared to journey farther than any European before him. His name was Marco Polo. Born into a family of merchants and explorers, Marco's journey would carry him across deserts, mountains, and mighty rivers, through the heart of Asia and into the vast empire of the legendary Kublai Khan. For over 2 decades, he would live among the Mongols, serve in the court of the Khan, and witness wonders most Europeans could scarcely imagine. Cities of shining stone, palaces of gold and silk, black stones that burned like wood, and ships that dwarfed anything in the West. His story, written down after he returned, would spark the imagination of generations, from cartographers and kings to adventurers like Christopher Columbus. Some called it fantasy. Others called it the beginning of global discovery. This is the tale of Marco Polo, not just a voyage across the Silk Road, but a bridge between worlds, between East and West, between myth and history. Told in 10 parts, this series brings to life one of the greatest journeys ever recorded, blending historical accuracy with rich storytelling to guide you through deserts, palaces, and ports across medieval Asia, all the way to the sea. Prepare to ride with camels, dine with emperors, and sail through storms. This is Marco Polo, Across the Silk Road to the Sea, Part 1, The Merchant Son of Venice. Long before he became the most famous traveller in European history, Marco Polo was simply the son of a Venetian merchant. Born in 1254 in the bustling Republic of Venice, Marco came into a world defined by trade, rivalry, and curiosity. Venice, nestled in the Adriatic Sea, was not just a city, it was a powerhouse of commerce. Her ships carried silks and spices from the east. Her merchants haggled with Byzantines, Saracens, and Franks, and her people looked to the horizon as both a marketplace and a mystery. Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle, Maffeo, were men of this world, brothers, partners, and experienced traders who had already travelled beyond Constantinople and deep into the unknown. At the time of Marco's birth, however, the 2 Polos were nowhere near Venice. They were in far-off lands, on a journey that would shape not just their own destinies, but Marco's as well. It began years earlier, in 1260, when Niccolo and Maffeo left Constantinople on a trading venture to the Black Sea port of Soldaia. From there, they travelled eastward through the lands of the Mongols, lands little known to Europeans, but forming the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Mongol Empire, under the rule of Genghis Khan's descendants, stretched from China to Eastern Europe, and ruling the eastern part, including China, was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, emperor of the Yuan dynasty, and one of the most powerful men alive. By a mix of circumstance and courage, the Polo brothers eventually reached the court of Kublai Khan in Dadu, present-day Beijing. The Khan, fascinated by the strangers from the West, welcomed them warmly. He questioned them closely about Europe and the Pope, and asked them to return to their homeland with a message. He gave them a letter for the Pope, requesting 100 educated men to come to his court and share the wisdom and teachings of Christianity and the West. He wanted knowledge, ideas, exchange. The Mongol ruler, though fierce, was also curious. And so, the Polos returned west. But the journey was not swift. They finally reached Venice again in 1269, 9 years after they had left, and it was only then that Niccolo met his son, Marco, now 15 years old. His mother had died during his absence, and the young boy had been raised by relatives. He was intelligent, well-educated, and already fluent in the language of trade. But now his path would change forever. 2 years later, in 1271, the Polos set out once again, this time with Marco in tow. They carried with them letters from the newly elected Pope Gregory X and gifts for the great Khan. The mission, to fulfill the Khan's request and further the bonds between East and West. The journey would be long, perilous, at times nearly impossible. They travelled not by sea, but overland, through the rugged terrain of the Middle East, across Persia, over the desolate plateaus of Central Asia, and along the ancient arteries of the Silk Road. Their route would eventually bring them to China, but it would take 4 years. For Marco, it was a world far beyond anything he had known. He saw deserts that seemed to stretch into the sky, mountains that scraped the heavens, cities that bustled with unfamiliar languages, colours, and customs, and most importantly, he observed, asked, and remembered. Even in his teens, Marco showed a gift for noticing detail. He watched how people lived, how they governed, how they traded. He recorded what plants grew where, what animals lived in which region, and how customs changed with the climate. What others might have ignored, Marco captured. They passed through Armenia, the Kingdom of Georgia, and the crumbling remnants of old Crusader states. In Persia, they encountered the remnants of the once mighty Seljuk Empire and crossed paths with the feared assassins, shadowy agents of terror hiding in mountain fortresses. As they pushed deeper into Asia, the climate grew harsher. In the deserts of northern Iran, water was scarce and danger constant. Bandits stalked the routes. Cities were miles apart. But the Mongol Empire, for all its reputation for conquest, had created something unprecedented: stability. Under what was known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol rule brought peace and safe passage to the Silk Road. Roads were repaired. Couriers relayed messages across thousands of miles. Laws were enforced. For a brief moment in history, it was safer to travel from Venice to Beijing than it would be centuries later. Still, the journey was brutal. Crossing the vast deserts of Central Asia, the Karakum and the Gobi, tested the limits of endurance. Marco would later describe mirages, heat so intense it cracked the ground, and sandstorms that could swallow a caravan. But also, he wrote of beauty, turquoise lakes that shimmered in the dawn, caravanserais bustling with traders from India, Persia, Arabia, and China. It was during this part of the journey that Marco began to mature not only as a traveller, but as a thinker. He began learning Mongolian, Persian, and the Chinese dialects spoken by the people they passed. He wrote later that he began to understand the customs of the Tartars, referring to the Mongols, and respected their strength, discipline, and adaptability. When the Polo party finally reached the eastern edge of the empire after crossing the Pamir Mountains and the Taklamakan Desert, they had travelled through more cultures than most Europeans even knew existed. In 1275, after 4 grueling years, they arrived at Kublai Khan's court. And there, everything changed. They entered a world of gold and jade, of silk banners and thundering gongs, of scholars and soldiers, elephants and astronomers. They beheld the capital city of Dadu, larger and more advanced than any European city of the time. And at the heart of it all stood the emperor himself, Kublai Khan. Marco Polo was just 21 years old, but the journey that had brought him from the canals of Venice to the heart of Asia was only the beginning, because the Khan saw something in the young man, something that would shape the next 17 years of Marco's life, and make him witness to one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Part 2. the court of Kublai Khan. When Marco Polo entered the imperial city of Dadu, modern-day Beijing, he stepped into a world unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was the capital of the mighty Yuan dynasty, ruled by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and the first non-Chinese emperor to rule all of China. Towering walls surrounded the city. Wide paved streets bustled with horses, carts, and foot traffic. There were public parks, grand temples, and an astonishing palace complex where fountains, gardens, and halls flowed together like a dream. Marco had grown up in Venice, the pride of Europe, but Dadu made Venice look like a village. And then there was Kublai Khan himself. According to Marco's account, the Khan was a man of commanding presence, even in his 70s. He had a broad forehead, deep-set eyes, and an air of authority that needed no announcement. Though aged, he was sharp of mind and surrounded by advisors, astrologers, and foreign envoys. He was a warrior, yes, but also a philosopher king, a man who had conquered by the sword, but ruled with laws and learning. Marco, with his bright eyes, quick tongue, and keen curiosity, made an immediate impression. While his father and uncle had already won the Khan's trust on their first visit years before, it was Marco who intrigued the emperor most. He listened to Marco's tales of the West, of Rome, the Pope, and the lands of Europe, and soon he gave the young Venetian something extraordinary: his confidence. Not long after their arrival, Marco Polo entered the service of the Khan. He learned to speak several Asian languages, including Mongol and Chinese dialects. And more importantly, the Khan trusted him to act as a messenger, envoy, and even a governor in distant provinces. For the next 17 years, Marco would travel not as a mere guest, but as a representative of the most powerful ruler on earth. He was sent to Yunnan, a wild and mountainous region in the far southwest of China, where few outsiders had ever set foot. He marveled at the jungles, the strange beasts, and the tribal peoples who had never heard of Venice or Rome. He rode through Tibet, describing monks who lived in silence and ate nothing but rice and milk. In India, he witnessed cities bustling with pearls, elephants adorned in jewels, and spices more fragrant than anything in Europe. And through it all, he observed. He took notes, and later he remembered. According to the travels of Marco Polo, he described the use of paper money, still unknown in Europe at the time. He explained how the Khan's empire operated on an elaborate postal system. Thousands of horses, relay stations, and riders that could carry messages faster than any army. He spoke of the cultivation of tea, the sophistication of Chinese medicine, and cities with populations in the millions, when most European cities barely reached tens of thousands. One of the most remarkable things he described was the use of black stones that burned like wood, coal, a form of energy that would not become widely used in the West for centuries. To his European audience back home, it all sounded impossible. Cities of marble, palaces where 1,000 guests dined in silence, armies with hundreds of thousands of men, bridges that stretched like spiders' webs across wide rivers, ships with 4 masts and compartments sealed against the sea. And yet, much of what Marco wrote has since been proven accurate. He wasn't simply repeating fairy tales, he was documenting the world as he saw it. And thanks to his unique position at court, he saw more than almost any other European in the Mongol Empire. But Marco's journey wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. He encountered Buddhists and Muslims, Mongols and Chinese, Hindu temples and Persian scholars. He watched different faiths coexist under the tolerance of the Khan, who, while a Buddhist himself, encouraged dialogue between religions. In the Khan's court, Confucian ministers debated with Nestorian Christians. Muslim astronomers consulted with Taoist sages. It was a cultural crossroads like no other, and for Marco, it was transformative. Though he remained Christian in name, he began to see the world not as us and them, but as many peoples, many truths, and many paths to understanding. Despite this, he never forgot where he came from. In his writings, he often compares what he sees to Venice or Rome. He views the world through European eyes, fascinated, sometimes skeptical, but always eager to learn. And though he grew wealthy in the Khan's service, he knew that he and his family were still foreigners in a vast land. They served at the Khan's pleasure, and when the court shifted, so could their fortunes. As the years passed, Kublai Khan grew older. His health declined. He mourned the loss of his favorite wife and son. And with his weakening grip came new dangers, political rivals, court intrigue, and rebellions at the edges of the empire. The Polos, ever pragmatic, began to consider returning home. But leaving the Khan's service was no small matter. Kublai had grown fond of Marco and relied on his loyalty. According to Marco's account, it took repeated requests before the Khan finally agreed to let them go, on one condition. They would escort a Mongol princess to Persia, where she was to be married to a powerful ruler allied with the Khan. It was a sea voyage that would take them through uncharted waters, across the South China Sea, through the Indian Ocean, around the coast of Arabia, and toward the Persian Gulf. And so, after 17 years in the east, the Polos left by sea, sailing not toward the Silk Road, but across the waters that would carry them back to the west. It would be a journey no less dangerous than the one that brought them here. But for Marco Polo, it was time to return, to tell the world what he had seen. Part 3. The Voyage Home, Storms and Kingdoms. In the year 1291, after nearly 2 decades of service in the Mongol Empire, Marco Polo and his family prepared to return to the west. But instead of retracing their long overland route along the Silk Road, the great Khan offered them a new path, by sea. Their assignment was clear: escort a Mongol princess, Kurkachin, to Persia, where she was to be married to Arghun Khan, a ruler of the Ilkhanate and a relative of Kublai. The journey would be long and dangerous, crossing open ocean and passing through kingdoms little known to Europeans. The fleet they joined was impressive. According to Marco's account, the expedition comprised 14 ships, large, multi-masted vessels with watertight compartments built to withstand storms and carry vast cargo. These were Chinese junks, far more advanced than anything Europe had at the time. Some were said to carry up to 600 passengers and crew. From the port of Zaitun, present-day Quanzhou in southern China, they set sail into the unknown. The first leg took them through the South China Sea, threading a path past the Philippines and into the tropical waters of Southeast Asia. Marco wrote of lands filled with spices, of islands where elephants roamed freely and birds of paradise flashed through jungle canopies. They stopped in Sumatra, where the dense rainforests and unfamiliar customs astonished him. The people, he noted, worshipped idols and lived in great houses built on stilts. He described the region's abundance of pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and other spices that were rare and expensive in Europe. But the voyage was far from smooth. Storms battered the fleet. Monsoon winds and typhoons turned the ocean into a cauldron. Several ships were lost. Hundreds of passengers and crew perished. The sea, for all its promise of a faster route, was a cruel and unforgiving force. And yet, the survivors sailed on. In the Straits of Malacca, between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, they navigated through waters teeming with pirates. These narrow passages, vital for trade, were also riddled with danger. Local rulers demanded tribute or tried to tax the fleet. The Polo Party, protected by their status and armed guards, managed to pass through without major conflict. Further west, they visited the Kingdom of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. Marco was captivated by the lush landscapes, the enormous pearls said to be found in its waters, and the legends surrounding Adam's Peak, a sacred mountain revered in multiple religions. He also observed the religious diversity that flourished along the trade routes. In Ceylon and southern India, he found Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians living side by side, each with their temples, rituals, and stories. For Marco, raised in a Europe often torn by religious division, this peaceful coexistence was as fascinating as the natural beauty of the land. The next stage took them along the coast of India, where he described the port cities of the Coromandel and Malabar coasts. These were vibrant hubs of commerce, crowded with ships from Arabia, Africa, and China. Marco noted the skilled Indian shipbuilders, the trade in gems and textiles, and the elephants used in war and ceremony. One particular marvel stood out to him: the way Indian merchants navigated the ocean. They used the stars and monsoon winds with remarkable precision, setting sail only during specific seasons. The science of these mariners impressed him deeply and made him aware that Europe still had much to learn. Sailing north toward Persia, the voyage took them past Hormuz, a strategic port at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Marco had visited it once before on his outward journey, but now he saw it through new eyes. Hormuz was a melting pot of goods and cultures. Persian rugs, Arab perfumes, African ivory, and Chinese porcelain all changed hands here. It was also here that they learned tragic news. Kublai Khan, the intended groom of Princess Kukachin, had died, but the Mongol princess still had value as a royal bride, and the Polos, still under imperial command, delivered her safely to the new ruler of Persia, Ghazan Khan, Argun's son. The princess was married into the new court, fulfilling the mission, though under altered terms. The Polos, for their part, were finally free to make their way home. They crossed overland through Persia and into the Caucasus, retracing parts of their original route in reverse. In Trebizond, a port on the Black Sea, they secured passage by ship to Constantinople, then finally to Venice. The year was 1295. Marco Polo was now in his early 40s. He had been gone for 24 years. He arrived not with pomp or celebration, but to a city that no longer remembered him. Even his relatives doubted who he was. According to legend, he and his father and uncle, dressed in ragged Mongol garments, spoke strange languages, and bore themselves more like Eastern lords than Venetian citizens. To prove their identities, the Polos hosted a banquet. During the meal, they reportedly sliced open their coats and poured out jewels, pearls, and gold that had been sewn into the linings. The stunned guests could hardly believe it. They were home, but Marco Polo's journey was not over, not yet, because what he had seen demanded to be told. And in a prison cell, not long after his return, he would begin to dictate one of the most influential travel narratives ever written. Part 4, The Book of Marvels. Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295 as a man transformed. He had travelled across continents, sailed distant seas, and served at the court of the most powerful emperor on earth. Yet his homecoming was not marked with parades or applause. Venice, embroiled in constant rivalry with Genoa, was at war, and Marco found himself swept into its conflicts. In 1298, just 3 years after his return, Marco was captured during a naval battle against the Genoese and imprisoned in a dank cell far from the Silk Road, in the heart of Genoa's city walls. It might have ended there, but fate intervened in the form of a fellow prisoner, Rustichello da Pisa. Rustichello was a writer, known for composing romances of knights and heroes, and he quickly recognized that his cellmate was no ordinary man. As the days passed, Marco began to tell him stories, not fictions, but lived experiences, of Kublai Khan's palace, of snow-covered mountains, of black rocks that burned hotter than wood, of beasts never seen in the West. Rustichello, with a writer's flair and a traveller's awe, began to write them down. Together, they created a book that would be called Il Milione, or The Million, sometimes known simply as The Travels of Marco Polo. In Latin, it would spread across Europe as Dévisement du Monde, the description of the world. It was unlike anything Europe had ever read. It did not read like a religious pilgrimage or a knight's tale. It was part geography, part travelogue, part catalogue of marvels. It described lands and peoples far beyond the boundaries of European understanding, some of them real, some perhaps misunderstood, and some that readers swore must be imagined. He spoke of paper money used across the Mongol Empire, backed by the authority of the great Khan. He described the efficient postal system, the Yam, with its relay stations and horse messengers spread across tens of thousands of miles. He noted the use of coal in China, at a time when Europeans still burned only wood. And he described great cities, Hangzhou, for example, with its wide canals, stone bridges, and population of over 1 million, at a time when Paris, the largest city in Europe, held only a fraction of that. Readers could hardly believe it. He spoke of islands where spices grew in abundance, of pearls as large as walnuts, of unicorns, likely rhinoceroses, and of courtiers whose clothes were sewn with actual gold. Perhaps most famously, he described the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court in Dadu. The vast marble palace, the hall supported by gilded pillars, the ceremonial processions of thousands dressed in silk. He recounted the Khan's annual hunting expeditions, where entire tent cities were erected and tens of thousands of horsemen rode at his side. And yet, for all its marvels, the book also showed curiosity, method, and a desire to understand. Marco wrote of the customs of various peoples, their foods, clothing, marriage rites, and legal systems. He described the terrifying winds of the Gobi Desert, the heights of the Pamir Mountains, and the rituals of Hindu temples in India. He even wrote of Japan, Zipangu, though he never visited it himself, describing it as a land of immense wealth and mystery. The book spread rapidly, copied by hand and translated into many languages, but it was also met with skepticism. How could one man have seen so much? How could China be more advanced than Europe? How could the Mongols, a people once dismissed as barbarians, rule over such a vast and efficient empire? Some called him Il Milione, not because of the book's name, but as a joke, suggesting he told 1 million lies. And yet, much of what he described was later confirmed by explorers, missionaries, and scholars. His observations, however astonishing, were often accurate, though some accounts may have been exaggerated by Rustichello's literary flair or by Marco's own imagination, many details were grounded in fact. Marco himself insisted that he had only written down a portion of what he had seen, fearing people would find the truth too unbelievable. "I have not told the half of what I saw," he once reportedly said. His book would become one of the most influential travel narratives in history. It inspired mapmakers, scholars, and dreamers. In a world where the East was cloaked in mystery, Polo offered a keyhole through which Europe could peer. His detailed descriptions of trade routes, goods, customs, and cities made him an indispensable source for merchants and kings, and perhaps the most famous of all those who read him was a young man in Genoa, born a century later, Cristoforo Colombo, known in English as Christopher Columbus. Columbus carried a copy of Marco Polo's book with him on his voyage west, believing that by sailing across the Atlantic, he might reach the rich courts of China and the spice ports of the Indies that Polo had so vividly described. The book was marked with notes, the margins scribbled with plans and dreams. Thus, Marco Polo's influence didn't just echo, it sailed. Back in Venice, after his release from prison, Marco Polo returned to a quiet life. He married, raised 3 daughters, and resumed the work of a merchant. Though he was wealthy, respected, and known, he never again left Italy. In 1324, at the age of 69 or 70, Marco Polo died. On his deathbed, priests urged him to confess and recant any falsehoods he may have written. He refused. "I did not tell half of what I saw," he said again. His tomb lies in the church of San Lorenzo in Venice. There is no great monument, just a name and the echo of a journey that stretched from the canals of Venice to the palaces of the East and across the boundless seas. Part 5. The world he saw. The world Marco Polo described in his book was not only vast, it was layered, complex, and dazzlingly interconnected. Through his eyes, Europe was introduced to a web of cities, kingdoms, and cultures stretching from the Mediterranean to the shores of the Pacific. Much of what we know about the 13th century East, especially China and Central Asia, comes from Marco's meticulous, if occasionally exaggerated, observations. His words painted pictures not just of distant places, but of a global world far more advanced and dynamic than Europe had previously imagined. Let us walk now through some of the wonders he recorded. First, there was China, then ruled by the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Marco was deeply impressed by the wealth and order of Chinese cities. He described Hangzhou, then one of the largest cities in the world, as a place of 100 bridges and teeming markets. Its canals and waterborne trade reminded him of Venice, but on a scale he had never seen. He noted that markets were carefully organized. There were separate stalls for silks, spices, paper, gold, and even for the trade of rare animals. The city was lit at night, and law enforcement was visible and effective. Public bathhouses were common, and even the poor had access to food and water. And then there was Dadu, modern Beijing, the imperial capital of the great Khan. Here, Marco marveled at the architectural harmony of the palace grounds. The halls were said to be vast, with ceilings held aloft by golden pillars. Colored tiles gleamed. Gardens were filled with peacocks and fountains. Silk carpets muffled the footsteps of servants. The palace complex was also a center of governance. The great Khan, Kublai, ruled not just by conquest, but by bureaucracy. Marco described a civil service system where officials were promoted by merit and examinations, an idea that wouldn't reach Europe for hundreds of years. Paper money amazed him. Issued by the state and backed by royal decree, it was accepted everywhere in the empire. Marco even described how counterfeiters were punished severely to maintain trust in this novel form of currency. Then there was the postal system, which he praised at length. Relay stations were set at regular intervals, stocked with fresh horses and supplies. Couriers could travel up to 250 miles per day. The system was so reliable that even small parcels or letters could be sent across the empire in days. To Marco, it was more efficient than anything in Europe, and another example of the Mongol ability to manage vast distances. But his observations weren't limited to cities and infrastructure. He was equally fascinated by the customs of everyday life. He noted the different diets of people across the empire: rice in the south, millet in the north, and yak butter tea in the highlands of Tibet. He wrote about foot binding, which he observed in southern China, and about the clothing of Mongol warriors, which was simple but functional, allowing for swift movement on horseback. He wrote of tea, still unknown in Europe, describing how it was dried and steeped in hot water. He mentioned the use of chopsticks and the etiquette of the imperial court, where bowing, silence, and elaborate ceremonies governed every interaction. One of Marco's most interesting chapters described the Mongol army. He noted their incredible discipline, their use of compound bows, their coordination in battle, and their clever tactics, like feigned retreats and encirclements. He was particularly amazed at how soldiers carried dried food and milk powder to travel light and fast. Each warrior had multiple horses and rotated them to avoid exhaustion. To Europeans who still thought of Mongols as unwashed barbarians, Marco's account was a revelation. These were not savages. They were strategists. Marco also gave vivid descriptions of the many different peoples within the Mongol Empire: Uyghurs, Tibetans, Persians, Burmese, Hindus, and Muslims. He observed their religions, clothing, dialects, and habits. Some he admired. Others he found strange or unsettling, but always he recorded them with the eye of a witness, not the pen of a preacher. He was especially fascinated by India. Though he visited only briefly, his curiosity never waned. He described temples carved from stone, sacred rivers, and the ritual of sati, where widows would sometimes throw themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres. He wrote of merchants who made fortunes trading pearls and diamonds, and of animals like the elephant, used in war and ceremony alike. He also mentioned Japan, or Zipangu as he called it, though he never visited it himself. Based on accounts he heard at court, Marco described it as an island nation rich in gold and ruled by a powerful king. He claimed its palaces had golden roofs and that it resisted Mongol conquest with fierce determination. While some of his reports were clearly second-hand or exaggerated, they inspired intense interest back in Europe. And through it all, Marco Polo noticed the coexistence of cultures. In the markets of Samarkand, he saw Chinese traders bargaining with Arab merchants. In Hormuz, Persians dined alongside Indians. In the halls of the great Khan, Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims debated theology before an emperor who tolerated them all. For 13th century Europe, still deeply fractured by religious wars and superstition, this vision of a global, multicultural empire was nothing short of revolutionary. To be sure, Marco's book contains errors. He missed or misrepresented some important features of Chinese civilization, such as the Great Wall, perhaps because by his time it was already in disrepair, and his terminology could be imprecise. He often used Tartars or Saracens to refer to entire ethnic or religious groups, but the larger truth remained. He had seen the world, and more than that, He had made Europe see it too. His book was not just a travel diary. It was a mirror held up to the West, reflecting back a world much older, richer, and more interconnected than it had ever imagined. Part 6. The Empire of the Khans. To understand Marco Polo's journey, you must understand the world he was moving through. And in the 13th century, that world was ruled by one name above all others: Khan. The Mongol Empire, at its height, was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Stretching from the coasts of Korea to the plains of Hungary, from the Arctic tundra to the shores of the Arabian Sea, it united more land under one rule than any empire before or since. At its heart sat the descendants of Genghis Khan, the fierce horseman who began it all. Marco Polo's path led him directly into the orbit of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, the most powerful man in Asia, and arguably the world. Kublai, unlike his grandfather, was not merely a conqueror. He was a ruler, a builder, and a man of vision. When Marco met him in the 1270s, the Khan was already an aging monarch, but still sharp and commanding. From his vast palace in Dadu, modern Beijing, he governed a realm as diverse and complex as the lands it stretched across. Kublai's domain was the Yuan dynasty, the first time China had been ruled entirely by a foreign power. But Kublai had embraced Chinese governance, adopting Confucian advisors, building schools and temples, and restructuring the administration to balance Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and Turkish traditions. Marco, perhaps more than most foreigners, saw Kublai not as a barbarian king, but as a sophisticated and surprisingly tolerant emperor. He described how the Khan appointed ministers from many backgrounds: Chinese scholars, Muslim astronomers, Nestorian Christian scribes. He encouraged debates among the major religions. His empire was not built on conversion, but on control, on trade, roads, intelligence, and diplomacy. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, commerce flourished. Caravans traveled safely from Persia to China. Silk, jade, spices, and tea flowed westward. Silver, glass, wool, and horses came east. Ideas passed too: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Silk Road, for centuries a corridor of danger, had become a highway of exchange. But maintaining such an empire came at a cost. Kublai Khan ruled over 4 main khanates, each governed by branches of Genghis Khan's descendants. 1. The Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai himself. 2. The Ilkhanate in Persia. 3. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. The Golden Horde in the Russian steppes and Eastern Europe. These khanates cooperated and competed in equal measure. Though united by ancestry and shared respect for Genghis Khan's legacy, they often quarreled over borders, tribute, and influence. Kublai's claim to be the Great Khan was not universally accepted by the other branches. An internal rebellion was always a threat. Marco, during his years in the East, observed these tensions. He noted rebellions in southern China, battles on the empire's frontiers, and the complexities of administering such a multicultural realm. But what astonished him most wasn't the empire's problems. It was its systems. The Great Khan's court operated with meticulous organization. Everything was catalogued. Grain stores were tracked by accountants. Military horses were logged by region. Water supplies, bridges, fortresses, markets, each had bureaucrats assigned to manage them. Even the royal hunts served a purpose. Thousands of horsemen, falconers, and attendants followed the Khan across the grasslands during the seasonal hunts. To the outsider, It may have looked like sport, but it was also training, a way to keep the army sharp, the commanders in motion, and the empire's vast territory under visible control. Kublai also invested heavily in infrastructure. He expanded the Grand Canal, linking the fertile south to the political north. He repaired and built roads, introduced standardized weights and measures, and improved agricultural productivity by encouraging rice farming and flood control. Marco was particularly fascinated by the empire's religious policy. Unlike Europe, which was racked by crusades and heresy trials, Kublai's empire allowed multiple faiths to coexist. Marco described how Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims, and Christians all had official recognition. Kublai himself showed great interest in Buddhism, but employed people of all beliefs. This was both political strategy and personal curiosity. However, the Mongol Empire was not without brutality. Marco witnessed or heard accounts of cities razed during conquest, enemies executed by the thousands, and harsh punishments for those who defied the law. The Mongols were tolerant rulers, but merciless conquerors. They crushed opposition with precision and overwhelming force. Their military, which Marco described in detail, was one of the best in the world. Mongol warriors were expert archers, superb horsemen, and disciplined beyond measure. They used complex signaling systems, psychological warfare, and scouting units that often knew more about the enemy than the enemy knew about themselves. Marco also detailed how the empire maintained control over distant provinces. Governors were often rotated to prevent corruption. Spies reported back to the Khan. Postal inspectors checked routes regularly, and taxes, while burdensome, were generally fair, collected in goods or money, depending on the local economy. To Marco, it was a strange paradox. A people once feared as nomadic raiders had built an empire of law, learning, and commerce. They had adapted and adopted what they needed, whether Chinese administration, Persian mathematics, or Islamic astronomy, and fused it into something new, a global empire in the truest sense. He may have arrived expecting savagery. What he found was sophistication. And in Kublai Khan, he found a ruler who, despite his Mongol origins, had become a statesman of global ambition. But even as Marco marveled, the empire was beginning to fray. Kublai grew old and weary. The southern Chinese resisted Mongol rule. The costs of war, court luxury, and political intrigue began to take their toll. The other Khanates drifted further from Beijing's orbit. And when Kublai died in 1294, his empire, though still massive, was already beginning to crack. Still, Marco had seen it at its height. He had ridden with governors, dined in palaces, crossed deserts and mountains, and walked through cities that glowed at night while Europe slept in darkness. He had witnessed the empire of the Khans, not as a distant traveler, but as a trusted insider. And when he returned to Venice, he carried more than silk or jewels. He carried the memory of a world that Europe could scarcely imagine. Part 7. Trade winds and spice routes. Long before anyone in Europe dreamed of sea voyages to the Indies, before Columbus set sail or Magellan plotted a course around the world, the real wealth of the East moved not over oceans, but across land and sea, hand to hand, empire to empire. Marco Polo's journey placed him directly in the middle of that great economic artery, the Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes that connected China, Central Asia, India, Persia, Arabia, and ultimately the markets of Europe. But what many forget is that Marco's return voyage took him along another great path of trade, the maritime spice routes of the Indian Ocean. And in that journey, he saw how wind, water, and wealth shaped the world long before European ships ever crossed the equator. The Silk Road, as Marco first travelled it, was not a single path, but a series of overlapping routes linking cities and oasis towns across some of the most dangerous and beautiful landscapes on earth. From Samarkand to Kashgar, Baghdad to Xi'an, goods changed hands countless times. Silk, yes, but also paper, porcelain, lacquerware, jade, gunpowder, medicines, and tea. In return came silver, wool, glassware, coral, amber, and slaves. Each caravan stop was a melting pot. Arab merchants debated with Hindu traders. Chinese scholars read Persian poetry. Christian monks passed Muslim astronomers beneath the shade of desert trees. It was a corridor not only of commerce, but of ideas, science, religion, and innovation all flowed alongside the silks and gems. But it was the spice trade that truly captured European imagination. When Marco returned by sea, escorting the Mongol princess to Persia, he followed the great spice route that wound its way through Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian coast. Along this route, vast quantities of cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, black pepper, and cardamom made their way from the forests of the east to the markets of the west. Why were spices so valuable? In an age before refrigeration, spices preserved food and made the bland or spoiled taste palatable. They also held symbolic value, used in medicine, perfume, and religious rites. A single sack of pepper could buy a small house in Venice. Cloves were prized enough to be locked in vaults. Nutmeg was believed to ward off the plague. And yet, most Europeans had no idea where these spices came from. They imagined distant islands beyond maps, guarded by monsters or storms. Marco Polo had seen them with his own eyes. He described Sumatra, dense with jungle and wild elephants. He wrote about Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, where rubies and sapphires were said to be plucked from rivers. He spoke of the Andaman Islands, where the people were unfamiliar and the forests thick and humid. As the fleet moved through the Straits of Malacca, Marco observed how trade was managed by Malay, Chinese, Tamil, and Arab sailors. These were not pirates or tribal fishermen. These were experienced navigators, using the stars and monsoon winds to plan their journeys. The Indian Ocean, Marco realized, was not a barrier, but a bridge. Every year, the monsoon winds blew steadily in one direction for months, first eastward, then westward. This pattern allowed ships to leave ports in India or Arabia, travel to Southeast Asia or China, and return home months later with full cargo holds and empty sails. It was a predictable rhythm, and it created one of the most advanced maritime trading systems in the pre-modern world. Marco's descriptions of these ships were awe-striking for his European readers. He told of vessels with multiple masts and sails of woven palm leaves. Some had watertight compartments, an innovation that wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. These ships carried tons of goods and hundreds of passengers, often on voyages that lasted for months. At the port cities along the route, Calicut, Quilon, Cochin, Hormuz, Marco saw thriving markets where cultures blended effortlessly. He watched Indian Brahmins negotiate prices with Arab merchants. African ivory traded for Chinese porcelain. Persian carpets laid beside lacquered Japanese chests. Everywhere, religion and commerce mixed. Mosques beside temples, Jain shrines beside Catholic outposts. Buddhist monks collecting alms as merchants sold incense and coral. This was the early global economy, long before Europe even had a word for such a thing. Marco also saw the political dimensions of trade. He noted how rulers taxed every transaction, how entire cities grew rich simply by charging ships to dock and unload, how trade goods like silk or cinnamon could spark wars or form the basis of fragile alliances. The rulers of ports like Aden or Calicut held power not by the sword alone, but by their control of warehouses, tariffs, and access to markets. And he saw something else, something that shaped his view of the world forever. Europe was not the center of civilization. It was, in fact, a remote and relatively impoverished corner. The true centers of wealth and innovation were the cities along the Silk Road and the ports along the Indian Ocean. From Xi'an to Zanzibar, from Baghdad to Borneo, Marco saw cultures older, richer, and more sophisticated than the kingdoms of Christendom. And yet, his own account would bring those distant places into the imagination of a continent that had never seen them. Centuries later, the Portuguese would round the Cape of Good Hope. The Spanish would sail across the Atlantic. The Dutch and the English would follow, all chasing the same dream: access to the wealth of the East, the spices, the silks, the ports Marco had described. He had mapped the world, not with compasses or rulers, but with words. And those words would guide explorers, merchants, and monarchs for generations. Part 8. Myths, Maps, and Skeptics. When Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295 and dictated the story of his travels from a Genoese prison, he could not have known the fire he was about to ignite. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, was not merely a record of a journey. It was a keyhole view into an entirely different world. To medieval Europe, his descriptions were staggering. Cities with millions of people, paper money backed by imperial decree, ships the size of castles, and rulers who welcomed all religions under one roof. But not everyone believed him. In fact, many didn't believe him at all. From the moment Il Milione began circulating across Europe, skeptics sprang up in every court and university. How could one man, a merchant from Venice, have seen so much? And how could the East, so often viewed through the narrow lens of religious crusades and fables, be more advanced than the Christian West? Many readers accused Marco of exaggeration. Others thought Rustichello da Pisa, his co-author, had embellished the stories too much with the flourishes of a romance writer. Some believed Marco had never reached China at all, that he had simply pieced together stories overheard from Persian and Arab merchants. There were genuine reasons for doubt. For one, Marco never mentioned the Great Wall of China, something modern readers might find curious. But in the 13th century, the wall as we know it today did not exist in its current form. It was mostly neglected, in disrepair, or irrelevant under Mongol rule. To the Yuan dynasty, the northern frontier was already secure. Others pointed out that Marco gave few details about chopsticks, tea ceremonies, or certain Confucian practices. But Marco was not writing an ethnography. He focused instead on what he saw as extraordinary: infrastructure, customs, trade, and political organization. His lens was that of a merchant, not a monk or scholar. And yet, many of his most implausible claims would later be vindicated. For centuries, Europeans doubted his description of paper currency, until travelers to China in the 17th century confirmed its widespread use. They doubted the canal networks, the massive cities, the size of the Mongol court. But archaeological and historical records have since validated much of what Marco wrote. One of the great impacts of the travels was not just the tales it told, but the maps it inspired. Marco's descriptions of Asia, including detailed notes on place names, distances, and cultural markers, were used by early cartographers in Europe. His book served as the foundation for world maps produced in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially the influential Catalan Atlas and Fra Mauro's map. On these maps, you can see a fascinating blend of fact and fantasy. Lands like Cathay, China, and Zipangu, Japan, appear for the first time with recognizable geography. But alongside them are mythical beasts, monstrous races, and legendary places like the kingdom of Prester John, an imaginary Christian monarch said to rule in the East. Such was the tension in Marco's legacy, a mixture of marvels and misunderstandings. He described unicorns, likely rhinoceroses, and islands of cannibals, which might have stemmed from tales told to him along the way. He wrote of giant serpents in India, of magnetic mountains that pulled nails from ships, and of men with tails in the Andaman Islands. These were likely tales Marco recorded without full scrutiny, reflecting both curiosity and credulity. But we must remember, Marco was writing for a European audience raised on legends and saints' lives, not scientific journals. His goal was to inform and to amaze, and in that, he succeeded brilliantly. The most enduring testament to his influence is the fact that Christopher Columbus carried a copy of Marco's book on his voyages, heavily annotated in the margins. Columbus believed he could reach Cathay and the court of the great Khan by sailing west across the Atlantic. He was wrong, of course, but his dream was lit by the lantern Marco had carried across the East. Other explorers like Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan studied maps based on Marco's descriptions. The quest for the Spice Islands and the elusive Zipangu, Japan, came directly from his pages, and long after Marco's death, Europe's age of exploration was shaped by a world that he had first described. But perhaps what is most remarkable is not how Marco Polo changed maps, but how he changed minds. In a world still dominated by superstition, tribalism, and fear of the unknown, Marco presented a vision of global interconnectedness. He showed Europe that far from being alone, it was just one node in a vast pulsating network of civilizations, some older, some wiser, many richer. He described Mongol warriors and Persian scholars, Indian sultans and Chinese merchants, not as caricatures, but as people, capable, complex, human. His stories reminded readers that different didn't mean lesser, and that foreign lands could be as civil, lawful, and structured as their own. To be sure, the Travels was imperfect. It was coloured by the biases of its time and its teller. But it offered something rare in medieval Europe, a window, not a wall. And in doing so, it helped shift the imagination of a continent, from myths to maps, from fear to fascination. Part 9. The Merchant, the Messenger, the Man. For all the wonder that surrounded Marco Polo's stories, great Khans, glittering cities, storms at sea, and spices beyond imagination, it's easy to forget the man behind the legend. Who was Marco Polo really? What kind of person could survive such a journey, serve at the court of the most powerful ruler on earth, and return to tell the tale? To understand Marco, we must go back to his roots. A merchant of Venice. He was not born into nobility or schooled in the courts of Europe. He was born into a world of contracts, counting houses, and cargo ships. His father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo were experienced traders, not adventurers. They didn't seek glory, they sought opportunity, and when they brought Marco along in 1271, he was still a teenager. This background mattered. Marco viewed the East not through the eyes of a conqueror or a crusader, but as a businessman. He paid attention to markets, to laws, to the movement of goods and people. In his writings, he didn't dwell on miracles or legends. He wrote about grain prices in Yunnan, tax policies in Persia, and how paper currency was exchanged in Dadu. He was a pragmatist, a realist, and a survivor. The world he traveled through was not a peaceful one. He crossed war zones, deserts, and mountain passes where bandits and disease were constant threats. He watched empires rise and crack. He saw famines, rebellions, and funerals. He walked into cities where no European had ever stepped, and where none might ever again. And yet, through it all, he adapted. He learned Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and Turkish languages. He learned how to navigate court politics, how to present himself with humility before emperors, and how to ask questions that brought out information without offending local customs. Kublai Khan entrusted him with missions across Asia, not because Marco was of noble birth, but because he was sharp, observant, and reliable. He could serve as an emissary, a tax inspector, even a provincial governor. His word was trusted in a court where betrayal could mean death. But was Marco always truthful? The truth is complicated. There's no doubt that he saw much of what he described. His level of detail about distances, currencies, government systems, climates, and trade goods could only come from first-hand experience. But memory can blur, and storytelling is an art. With Rustichello da Pisa helping him write his narrative in prison, some flourishes were inevitable. And Marco was, after all, a showman too. His book wasn't written just to inform. It was meant to captivate, to keep readers turning the page. And in that goal, he succeeded spectacularly. But behind the spectacle was a deeply human figure, a man who, when finally released from Genoese captivity, returned home not to parades or crowns, but to the quiet work of a Venetian merchant. He married, had 3 daughters, and resumed managing his family's affairs. No more great voyages, no more khans or caravans, just the counting of ledgers, the weighing of goods, and the creak of ships in the Venetian harbour. He lived in a modest home in the San Lorenzo district. He was respected in Venice, but never fully embraced as a national hero. After all, his tales still danced on the edge of believability. Even his final years were spent clarifying what he had seen, insisting, even on his deathbed, that he had not lied. In 1324, Marco Polo died at around 70 years of age. He was buried in the church of San Lorenzo, though the exact location of his grave has been lost to time. There is no grand tomb or statue in the square, just the name and the echo. And yet, from that modest life sprang a ripple that would touch continents. Marco Polo had done something no other European had done at that time. Not just travel to the heart of Asia, but return, remember, and report. He preserved a record of a global world long before that term existed. He created a bridge between civilizations, a written passage from Europe to Asia. He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't even trying to be a historian. He was at heart a messenger. And he delivered something precious, a glimpse of a world far bigger, richer, and more complex than anyone in Europe had ever imagined. His words helped lay the groundwork for the age of discovery, for voyages that would redraw the map, for empires that would rise and fall chasing the same winds he once followed. He was flawed, he was human, but he changed the world not with a sword, but with a story. And that may be the rarest form of greatness there is. Part 10. Legacy Beyond the Horizon. Marco Polo never led an army. He never commanded a fleet. He didn't discover a new continent or rule an empire. And yet, few names from the Middle Ages have echoed louder through time. Why? because Marco Polo did something both simple and extraordinary. He looked beyond his world and then came back to tell us what he saw. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, became one of the most influential works of the late medieval period. It shattered the closed mental map of Europe. It suggested that the known world was only a fraction of what truly existed, and it whispered to every reader, "There's more. Go see it." In the centuries that followed his death, Marco's name became inseparable from exploration. His descriptions of the wealth of Cathay and the mystery of Zipangu stirred the ambitions of a new generation of adventurers. Christopher Columbus famously carried a copy of the Travels on his voyage west in 1492, annotated in the margins with dreams of reaching the riches of Asia. He believed that by sailing across the Atlantic, he would arrive at the shores described by Marco, a direct line to the court of the great Khan. He was wrong in direction, but right in desire. The hunger Marco had sparked carried Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, and countless others across unknown waters. And Marco's influence went beyond exploration. His book became a repository of global knowledge for early scientists, mapmakers, merchants, and theologians. It was translated into multiple languages and widely read across Europe. While some details faded into legend, others, like his observations of paper currency, postal systems, and large-scale urban planning, remained unmatched until centuries later. Even as the Mongol Empire fell and China withdrew into more insular policies, Marco's book kept the East alive in Western memory. It offered not just tales of treasure, but of order, law, tolerance, and complexity. It reminded Europe that power and prosperity could take different forms, shaped not by Christian kings, but by Buddhist emperors and Muslim sultans. And then there's the legacy of connection. Marco Polo's life embodied a rare openness to other cultures. He was not an invader or missionary. He was a guest, a foreigner who listened, adapted, learned. He traveled not to conquer, but to understand, and in doing so, earned the trust of people who might otherwise have seen him as a threat. In a time when the other was often seen as enemy or infidel, Marco saw individuals. He didn't romanticize everything he saw, and he certainly held his own prejudices, but he wrote with a spirit of curiosity, not condemnation. And that spirit is more relevant now than ever. In today's world, where borders still divide and cultures often clash, Marco's story reminds us of what it means to explore not just new lands, but new ideas, to sit at the table of strangers, to ask questions without fear, to find common ground even in unfamiliar soil. That's the true legacy of Marco Polo. Yes, he was a merchant, a traveler, a man of Venice. But his greatest contribution wasn't silk or spices. It was the invitation. To look further, to go beyond the horizon, to believe that wonder waits, if only we're bold enough to chase it. And though his grave is lost and his city changed, his journey continues. Each time someone opens a book, studies a map, boards a ship, or asks what lies just beyond the next hill. Marco Polo, the boy who left Venice, the man who served a Khan, the traveler who bridged two worlds, and the voice that still whispers to us today, "I have not told half of what I saw."